The Ice Age is a major mystery of Earth science. There are at least 60 theories for the origin of the Ice Age. All of them have serious problems, but we can explain it as the aftermath of the flood, which shows that the flood was a real event and also verifies what we read in the Bible. We can trust the Bible as God's Word.
Welcome to the Flood Geology series, the programs where leading scientists take you exploring around the world to view the geologic evidence for the biblical flood and how its effects shaped the Earth during and after this worldwide cataclysmic event only 4,300 years ago.
Ice Age became believed by geologists starting in 1840. It was an assault on uniformitarianism because there weren't glaciers around, continental glaciers covering much of Northern Europe and North America at the present time. So present processes can't account for the glaciation. So the Ice Age has been a major mystery ever since it was discovered. A special issue of U.S. News and World Report in August 1997 came out. The whole issue dedicated to the 18 greatest mysteries of science. Some of these mysteries were mysteries of their own making because they believe in evolution and can't explain a number of things. And one of the 18 is what causes ice ages? So they really don't know. An ice age is essentially defined as a great increase in ice and snow. What do you need for an ice age? First of all, you need a lot cooler summers and a lot more moisture, and it has to persist year after year. Right now, 10% of the land surface of the Earth is covered by ice, mainly the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. But during the Ice Age, 30% of the continental areas were covered. Practically all of Canada, the northern United States, the mountains of the western United States, northern Europe, in the Andes Mountains, in the mountains of Tasmania. Well, how do we know that ice covered these areas? The way to find out is you go to currently glaciated areas today, and practically all the glaciers in the world are receding, and so when they recede, you find out what they do. Well, here we are in the beautiful Cascade Mountains of Oregon. We're at below Elliott Glacier on the north slope of Mount Hood. Now, Elliott Glacier was once much larger and it's actually part of the local mountain glaciers on the stratovolcanoes in the Cascades. At the end of the Ice Age, the glaciers melted, and during the recent 130 years, the glaciers have mostly melted around the Earth, revealing what a glacier produces. It produces moraines, like this lateral moraine we're on right now, and down in the middle there's what's called ground moraines. And generally out in this area there would be end moraines, but the end moraine is broken all the way through, probably from glacial meltwater that has destroyed it. An end moraine is where debris is piled up in front of a glacier, the terminal part of the glacier, or the end of the glacier. That's why they call it a terminal or end moraine. And also it piles up along the edge. Those are called lateral moraines. Also, debris piles up where it melts, and it kind of forms a rolling surface with erratic boulders on the top. That's called ground moraine. And that's what we see around glaciated areas today. We can go to areas like this, which were previously glaciated, to see what glaciers produce in the rocks. One of them is this lateral moraine. A second one is it scratches the bedrock as boulders and all kinds of other debris, cobbles, gravel, ends up in the bottom of the glacier. It scrapes across the bedrock, forming striations and scratches. And then the rocks at the bottom of the glacier also get scratched. And a lot of times you see these scratched boulders left in the moraines, like this one that I'm standing on right here has scratches going like this. And it's been smoothed off at the top, called faceted. You look for these features, moraines, scratched bedrock, and scratched boulders in other areas of the Earth. And this is how they concluded that there was an ice age not that long ago. Here we are in the Sun River Canyon in the Northern Rockies, along the first cliff that you see. It's only about 800 foot, and the glacier formed in the Northern Rockies and moved out onto the high plains about 15 miles and moved through here. Here we found some weak striations or scratches. I've seen better ones on this ridge, especially since the cracking of the rock is semi-parallel. There are glacial striations for when the rocks collected at the bottom of the glacier move, and as they move, they scratch the bedrock and the rocks get scratched. In terminal moraines and even ground moraines, you commonly find scratched and grooved boulders that were carried on the bottom of the ice and scratched against bedrock. This appears to be one. It's limestone from the Rocky Mountain front on this terminal moraine we're on. It looks like it could see scratches in it right like this. As it was going along the bedrock, it flattened this. It's called a facet. So you find faceted and striated or grooved rocks commonly in terminal moraines. It's evidence of glaciation. Now, around the world where it's been glaciated, especially mountainous areas, you have some very distinctive moraines. In fact, they come out from a mountain valley. You find these around the eastern Sierra Mountains, around the Wind River Mountains. The best example that I've ever seen is in the northeastern Wallowa Mountains, where you have a horseshoe-shaped moraine, an end moraine about 100 feet tall, and lateral moraine 600 feet tall, very sharp looking, that come out, and inside Lake Wallowa has filled it up. Right here we're standing on a terminal moraine from the ice sheet over the Northern Rockies that came out of the Sun River Canyon right over there. But right in the middle here it broke through. A lot of times moraines pond lakes, and this lake probably broke through right in here, and this is a Willow Creek. And they found that a great place to put a reservoir where it broke through, and so it's Willow Creek Reservoir near Augusta, Montana. We are in the lower canyon of the Clarks Fork River before it enters the Bighorn Basin. The Clarks Fork River runs between the Absaroka Mountains on the south and the Beartooth Mountains on the north, which were glaciated during the Ice Age, right after the flood. Probably a channel of the ice came down the Clark Fork Valley and moved to this position right here where we see a terminal moraine. And then as the ice retreated, it formed a lake in here, and the lake overtopped the moraine over on the south part there and sent a flood down the valley where you can see all kinds of big, huge, rounded rocks from that outwash flood. An erratic boulder is a boulder that does not outcrop in the local area. In fact, this type of rock is called argillite, a slightly metamorphic shale. You can see the platy shale look of it, but it's been heated up and hardened some. This type of rock doesn't even outcrop in Oregon. It got here by the Lake Missoula flood. Glacial Lake Missoula filled up to 2,000 feet deep in the valleys of western Montana by a finger of the ice sheet, the Cordilleran Ice Sheet in northern Idaho, 2,500 feet deep. And it broke through that and came through eastern Washington. It came through the Columbia Gorge 1,000 feet deep, and then it spread out in the Portland-Vancouver area and moved over Portland about 400 feet deep, and it backwashed up this Willamette Valley here about 500 feet above sea level, or about 400 feet deep. And it brought all these erratic boulders, and the Willamette Valley has hundreds of erratic boulders, of which this one is the largest one. Right now it weighs 90 tons. That's how this erratic boulder got here during the Lake Missoula flood, which indicates that there was an ice age that formed the lake and caused the Lake Missoula flood and deposited this erratic here. Well, here we are at Turner, Montana, a couple miles from the Canadian border in north central Montana, on the highest terrain in the area called the Flaxville Planation Surface. And here we have a large erratic boulder from the Ice Age. Now this erratic boulder is nice, kind of like a banded granite. This type of rock does not outcrop anywhere close to here, hundreds of miles. The nearest source is the Canadian Shield to the north, about 400 miles. You'll find them in farmers' fields piled up by the hundreds. This erratic was from the continental ice sheet, whose boundary was to the south, about 40 miles from here. The continental ice sheet extended over central and eastern Canada and the northeast and north central United States. The question is, how did they all get here? Did the ice move them from the Canadian Shield slowly? There's a slight problem with that, because when you look at how thick the ice was in this area, it was actually very thin. The Flaxville Plateau further to the east was sticking above the ice, and to the north we have the Wood Mountain Plateau in Saskatchewan that was unglaciated, so it's called a driftless area. Well, the boundary of the ice was 40 miles to the south. And we know to the west it was thin too, because the western end of the Cypress Hills stuck up 300 feet above the ice. So the ice was only about 700 feet thick, about 100 miles north into Canada. So essentially the surface of it was thin and flat. For a glacier to move, it moves by its surface slope slowly. And if it slopes down to the south, it should move from the north to the south. But if there isn't any slope, there's a problem of it moving. Then how did this erratic get here if the ice was too thin to move it? When you have ice, it's got to melt. And during the melting phase of the ice, you have all kinds of glacial rivers and glacial lakes, and you have icebergs with rocks in it. So I postulate that this and all the tens of thousands of erratic boulders like this came down in icebergs and by water action as the ice was melting. In fact, you can see something of the action of water. This is what's called sub-rounded. Looks like water's been affecting this. And most of the erratics I've seen are either rounded or sub-rounded. Some of them they're huge and or small. So I think the glacial fluvial, as they call it, the action of big, huge floods from the ice and lakes at the edge of the ice sheet, moved these erratics from where they eroded from the bedrock to where we see them here today. Besides the mystery of the Ice Age, which they still can't explain, there's a lot of subsidiary mysteries or secondary mysteries associated with that. First of all, in Alaska and Siberia, only the mountains were glaciated, not the lowlands. Why would that happen? In fact, when they run their computer models, some models glaciate both Alaska and Siberia, both mountains and lowlands. So why? They don't really know. A second one is that when we examine the animals and plants and even invertebrates during the Ice Age, we find that it's a mix of animals that love the warmth and animals that love the cold. This is really odd, because when they run their Ice Age models, their Ice Age is very cold. The post-flood Ice Age model was quite different. So those very cold temperatures, it'd be very hard for warm climate animals to live. One of the most outrageous examples of this, it's called disharmonious associations, is in Northwest Europe. You had a lot of locations where hippopotamuses lived during the Ice Age. And when they died with cold-tolerant animals. Like in southern England, there's 100 locations where you find hippo fossils with woolly mammoths, reindeer, and muskox. How would you even get hippos up into Northwest Europe? This can be solved by the post-flood Ice Age. Another mystery is the extinctions. The animals, they thrive during the Ice Age. At the end of the Ice Age, the ones over 100 pounds and the larger birds mostly went extinct. In North America, 70% of these animals went extinct. And we're talking about sloths, saber-toothed tigers, woolly mammoths, the American mastodon, dire wolf. There's a huge number of them. It's the same thing in Europe and Asia, about 70%. In Australia, 90%, which brings up an interesting question. Only the very southeast tops of the mountains were glaciated during the Ice Age there, so why would 90% go extinct in Australia? In South America, it's about 60 to 70% went extinct. Africa is an anomaly. Hardly any animals went extinct. So there's lots of these mysteries, and it's only after the last. Why did they go extinct? Supposedly the ice sheets were melting and more land was showing up, and it was supposedly getting warmer. Why would they all go extinct at the end? Another mystery is that we had what I call wet deserts. There are dry areas now, or semi-arid areas, that during the Ice Age were much wetter. They had huge lakes, big rivers. For instance, in the southwest United States, we had about 3 dozen lakes during the Ice Age. Some of them were large, whereas now we got little tiny shriveled up lakes in the Great Basin and Death Valley. For instance, where Great Salt Lake exists right now, Great Salt Lake is an average of 12 feet deep. But where it exists now, we had a lake 800 feet deep called Lake Bonneville that was 8 times the area of Great Salt Lake. And we also had Lake Russell in the Owens Valley, and we had Lake Manly, which is about 600 feet deep in Death Valley. We had a big lake 600 feet deep. How did these lakes get there? The uniformitarians have lots of trouble getting even decent precip during the Ice Age to get an ice sheet. How are they going to get it in the dry areas? And we know that during the Ice Age, these lakes grew because Lake Bonneville grew at least 300-400 feet and overtopped the Red Rock Pass in southeast Idaho and cut the pass down about 350 feet and caused a flood for 8 weeks in southern Idaho on the Snake River. It's called the Lake Bonneville flood. So these lakes actually rose, and they were associated with the Ice Age because 2 of these lakes have shorelines on end moraines coming out of some of the mountains. For instance, out of the Sierra Mountains, Lake Russell was about 700 feet deeper than Mono Lake, and it cut a shoreline on the end moraine. Also, southeast of Salt Lake, you had a glaciation, and Lake Bonneville cut a shoreline on that. The evidence for these lakes is tremendous. We have shorelines all over there, very distinct shorelines and raised deltas, so we know these lakes existed. And it was the same in other areas of the world. Australia had a lot of lakes. Africa had a lot of lakes. The Dead Sea had a lake in it. All over the earth, where it was generally dry, we had lakes. And in the Sierra Desert and Saudi Arabia, which are very dry area now, we had evidence of lakes and big rivers. And we even have a lot of fossils of amphibious animals like hippos in the Sahara Desert during the Ice Age. And we had man lived by the thousands, and he left his cave art, tens of thousands of petroglyphs, they would be called, on rocks. How do you get this within a uniformitarian Ice Age? It's extremely difficult, if not impossible. Another mystery of the Ice Age was how all the animals spread to all the continents. And how did man spread? How did the animals in particular spread to North America, Central America, and South America? This is another mystery which can be solved by the post-flood rapid Ice Age. One of the most significant mysteries is the extinction of the woolly mammoths in Siberia, Alaska, and the Northwest Territories, Yukon Territory in the northwest part. A woolly mammoth is essentially a hairy elephant with 3 types of hair. The longest is about 3 feet long, the outer hair. Woolly mammoth had a hump on its head, small ears, a hump on its back, and its back sloped pretty good. There was another type of mammoth called the Columbian mammoth, was much larger, about 14 feet tall, while the woolly mammoth was about 11 feet tall. When you think of the Ice Age, usually it's these 2 woolly mammoths that come to your mind when you think of the animals of the Ice Age. Why they don't exist now, they're part of the Great Extinction at the end of the Ice Age. Not only that, there are other mysteries associated with their existence in Siberia. First of all, how many were there? If it was just a few, that wouldn't be any big deal, but according to the experts that study the mammals of the Ice Age in that region, there are millions of them still buried in the permafrost. The bones and tusks of the woolly mammoth are so well preserved, you can use the ivory of the tusks still today, and then some of our piano keys and cue balls are made out of mammoth ivory. Why are they well preserved? If they sat around in the elements, within a matter of 24 years they would have disintegrated. So why are they so well preserved? And again, why are they in the permafrost? Permafrost is rock hard. How would you get them down in the permafrost? Another mystery associated with the woolly mammoths is that you find some carcasses, and they define a carcass as any scrap of flesh. As far as whole carcasses, or mostly whole, we only have a couple dozen. And then when they analyzed the stomach contents, they discovered that the food was only half decayed. Why was it half decayed? If it sat around, it should be decayed quickly by the gastric juices and bacteria and the digestive enzymes and acids in the stomach. It doesn't end there. Other mysteries are some carcasses and skeletons are found in a general standing position, as if they got caught in a bog and sunk. Unfortunately, it's rare to find bog sediments around these carcasses. They're in a different type of sediment, which is a clue on why they died. Also, in some of the carcasses, because of the state of the blood, we found out that 5 of these animals suffocated. Also, the animals have broken bones. Like the Barasavaka mammoth had a broken forelimb and broken pelvis and broken ribs. It takes a lot to break the pelvis of a hairy elephant. Well, how can scientists explain all these mysteries during the Ice Age? Uniformitarian scientists have tried for 200 years. They come up with various ideas which have serious problems. One of them is they lived up there during a little warmer interglacial. The problem with that is you still have the bogs in the summer and the bog vegetation that's toxic to all these grazers. Most of the animals that lived up there, which is a couple dozen, ate grass. They were grazers. That doesn't fit. Others have said, well, maybe they're up there during a cold glacial period, which was maybe 10, 15, 20 degrees colder than it is today up there. Oh, but then what would they eat? Nothing would hardly grow. There wasn't enough to eat. Remember, there's millions of them. So they really are clueless because of their uniformitarian bias on explaining the mysteries of the woolly mammoths. There's also an idea associated with these uniformitarian hypotheses in that how specifically do we explain the state of decay of the vegetation in their stomachs. Baron Cuvier in the early 1800s had the idea that because it's only half decayed, it had to be quick frozen. And so he initiated the quick freeze hypothesis. Now, about 1960, Bird's Eye Frozen Food Company, which deals in frozen meat, decided to do a study on the cooling of meat and how fast it'd take to cool it and what temperatures you need. And they concluded that you'd have to quick freeze it down to a temperature of 150 degrees Fahrenheit below zero suddenly. Now that is quite an order to account for a climate change or a cold front that would do that. So the uniformitarian ideas fall far, far short. Then there's a group of scientists and even lay people that have tried to figure this out, and they could be called the non-creationist catastrophists, of which Immanuel Velikovsky about 50, 60 years ago was one of their chief advocates. And he was great at looking at the earth and seeing all these mysteries. The woolly mammoth was his chief mystery, the demise of the woolly mammoth in Siberia and Alaska. And he tried to explain it by Mars and Venus moving through the solar system, coming close to the earth and causing all these catastrophes. Other ideas is that the crust of the earth shifted on the mantle, and so the woolly mammoths were in a warm climate, suddenly shifted up toward the pole and froze instantly. So there you have ideas like that that are not believed by hardly anyone nowadays. The uniformitarian geologists claim there are 5 major ice age periods in Earth history. The last one was called the Pleistocene or Quaternary Ice Age, in the last 2.5 million years in their time scale. The other 4 are in hard rocks, and they're from 2 billion years old. There's one about 900 to 700 million years old. There's one about 450 million years ago, and there's one about 300 million years ago in their time scale. Some of these lasted 100 million years, and some of them they claim were so devastating that they completely covered the globe in ice and snow, which is actually a major problem, because if you ever did that, the reflection of sunlight back to space would cool it down to minus 100 degrees centigrade, and it would stay there permanently unless you had some monstrous catastrophe to break up that ice. So it's called snowball Earth. Now, their evidence is when they see a hard rock layer, they look at it and they say, oh, that looks like a glacial till sequence where you have rocks of various sizes floating in a finer grained matrix. Also, they've discovered you have scratched bedrock in some of these locations and scratched rocks. And also you have rocks in very fine layered sediment called dropstone barbites. These are supposedly the 3 diagnostic properties for an ancient glaciation found in the rocks. Well, right here we're at about 9,500 feet on top of the gravelly mountains of southwest Montana. Now, this area right here, you're seeing just a small part of this bedrock that was scratched. It's in sandstone. Actually, it used to be right up there about, 15 feet above my head. It's all kind of slumped down. All over in these rocks you find the scratched bedrock, but it's been broken up by probably sinking action in this valley here. Right here was an area where they claimed was another ancient ice age during what's called the Eocene, about 50 million years ago. It was based on scratched bedrock, which you can see right here. And over in here, they're scratched in different directions. And this was one of their evidence. And you look in some of the rocks around here, some of the rocks like this one right here, well-rounded, you find some scratches on that. So they said there's 2 out of 3 diagnostic criteria in here for an ancient ice age. And they also found some other what they thought were glacial sediments in Colorado. So they put it all together and we had an Eocene ice age, they claim, 50 million years ago. But one unfortunate problem presented itself. The Eocene in the uniformitarian system is very warm, based on all the tropical, subtropical vegetation we find at mid and even at high latitudes. So you can't have a glaciation when it's so hot. So they had to get rid of this, even though it had 2 out of 3 supposed diagnostic features for an ancient glaciation. How do you get out of it? How do you dodge where you claimed it was an ice age and now you don't? Well, they claimed it was a landslide. And you know something? I believe they're correct. In fact, I believe that's the answer for all those supposed ancient glaciations during those 4 major periods of Earth history in their time scale. And you can see some of the material on the landslide right here. It came down this way. And some of them are well-rounded quartzite rocks. And these quartzite rocks, we know where they outcrop. They outcrop about 100 miles to the west in central Idaho. That's the nearest outcrop is thick beds of quartzite. And they've been transported here in this area, and they're well-rounded. And there's also other types of debris in there that it picked up. When the floodwaters were running off the continents, the resistant rocks were carried and rounded, but it eroded a lot of other types of rocks. And these rocks were pulverized to fine particles or silt, and they ended up sometimes being deposited at the same time as the quartzite. And in this location, a lot of times the quartzites are found within a finer grained matrix, and so that's why they thought that was the till characteristic. But all it is the finer particles eroded during the flood runoff and moving the quartzites 100 miles. Now think of it, during the flood, early flood, you had a lot of sediment form and tectonics going on, and then you'd have a lot of landsliding, and actually it'd be submarine landsliding, it'd be under the water. And we can explain these features by gigantic submarine landslides during the flood. It can form the till-like feature where you have rocks floating in a finer grained matrix. That's the landslide signature also. It duplicates it. Also, as the landslide moves down a slope, it'll scratch the bedrock like you see right here. Also, scratched bedrock like this can be formed by water moving at high speeds with a lot of debris moving across it. It could also be formed by faulting and probably volcanic eruptions that push a lot of debris out. And scratched bedrock was even formed like this at Mount St. Helens when Spirit Lake came rushing up and then rushing down and carrying those millions of logs in there. And when it came up and down, it scratched the bedrock. So there's a lot of ways to scratch the bedrock besides glaciation. Because you have scratched bedrock is no automatic indication of an ancient ice age. So how much cooling during the summer do you need for an ice age? Well, you have to at least cool off the average temperature at least to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but actually the average temperature needs to be below 32 degrees Fahrenheit because the summer sun is so powerful it can melt snow and ice even well below freezing. How far below freezing? Well, in Antarctica they have net melting when the temperature warms up to 14 degrees Fahrenheit along the coastal areas. So that means you'd have to have temperatures around 14 degrees Fahrenheit average for the summer from the cool season to remain. Let's say you only need 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and along the edge of the ice sheet, the average summer temperature is around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So you need an average temperature drop of about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's such a huge amount of cooling. Secular scientists who believe in uniformitarianism or present processes of climate to account for past climate are wondering where they can get such a radical climate change. And they can't. It's a big problem. And that's why there's over 60 theories on the ice age, many of which have serious problems. Some of them have to do with things like reduced carbon dioxide. Some have to do with the Arctic Ocean sea ice melting and producing the moisture. See, they need moisture for the ice age. Some have to do with mountain building. But regardless, they all fall far short. An ice age is so difficult that when they try to model it in these computer simulations to try to get an ice age forming, they have to tweak their model a lot. And in one model, they did tweak their model. Oh, actually, they started with an ice sheet over the whole area that was glaciated of about 30 feet and expected it to grow. But it actually melted in 5 years. That shows you how difficult it is to form an ice age with present climatic conditions or even postulated past climatic conditions. Well, there is one theory of the ice age, secular ice age theory, that is very popular right now. It's called the Astronomical Theory of the Ice Age, or the Milankovitch mechanism. And it's based mainly on small changes in the Earth's orbital geometry going around the sun. It's actually an old theory, and it's been brought back in the 1960s and 1970s because they think it explains ice age cycles. See, they believe in multiple ice ages, and they like cycles. But the problem with this theory is that it's too small. The solar radiation changes for an ice age are way too small, and meteorologists have been pointing this out for well over 100 years. But then there's the question, well, if the ice age was part of biblical Earth history, where do we place it? Well, it's obvious that it's after the flood because we have nice sharp moraines and we have scratched bedrock that are very sharp and not weathered yet, so it's obvious that it happened after the flood. So this brings up the question of, well, could the Genesis flood have been the trigger, the climatic trigger for an ice age? Indeed, that is the case. How would that happen? How would the Genesis flood fulfill the 3 requirements for an ice age? Here we are at the ocean. The oceans play a vital part in the development of an ice age. What are the requirements for an ice age? First, you need much cooler summers. Winters are already cold enough in most areas where the ice occurred. The second ingredient is much more moisture, and that's where the ocean comes in with much heavier evaporation. The third mechanism is it needs to persist year after year to let the snow and ice build up year after year. So those are the three requirements for an ice age. Well, could the Genesis flood have been the trigger, the climatic trigger for an ice age? Indeed, that is the case. How would that happen? How would the Genesis flood fulfill the three requirements for an ice age? First of all, the Genesis flood was a gigantic tectonic and volcanic event. And after the flood, we'd have all this volcanic ash and aerosols trapped in the stratosphere after the flood. And these reflect a lot of sunlight back to space, cooling the surface, especially the continental areas in summer. So there's where you get your summertime cooling, is by all this volcanism. But volcanic ash and aerosols filter out within a matter of months to years. So there needs to be a mechanism to replenish the aerosols. And aerosols are very small particles, about a micron in diameter. You need a mechanism to replenish the aerosols and ash, and indeed you do. During the Ice Age, the Earth was still not quite in equilibrium from the flood, so you had a little bit of tectonics, a lot of volcanism going off. We have a lot of ash beds and other volcanic material indicating much higher volcanism during the Ice Age, and this would replenish the volcanic ash and aerosols in the stratosphere and keep the summer cooling continuing. These stratovolcanoes we have in the Cascades, like Mount Hood, is just one of many hundreds of post-flood volcanoes that were going off immediately after the flood for quite a while, probably because the Earth was still out of equilibrium from the flood and was still settling down. To the north of us, we can see three other stratovolcanoes, Mount Adams, Mount Rainier, and then Mount St. Helens with the top blown off. Geological equilibrium means that, the Earth had a huge tectonics, and as a result had a lot of cracks and magma coming up, causing a lot of volcanism. We had a lot of faulting. It took a while to settle down, and everything's slow up and the volcanoes lessen, so that we only have just a little bit of volcanism now and only small earth movements going on. In general, we would consider that geological equilibrium at the moment, even though we still have movements of faults and volcanoes going up, but it looks like a lot less than immediately after the flood. Now, we know that volcanoes cause cooling, in fact global cooling for the larger volcanoes, because in historical times we've measured this. For instance, when Mount Tambora went off in 1815, that's the largest eruption in historical time, it caused volcanic ash and aerosols to go around the globe, and it caused a year without a summer, they call it, in 1816 in the northeast United States and also northern Europe. There was crop failures, summer frosts, harvests that failed. We know that volcanoes cause cooling. Other volcanoes cause cooling, like Krakatoa caused cooling, Mount Pinatubo, El Chichon. These were volcanoes that went. These last two are volcanoes that went off in the last 30 years, and these have all caused a little bit of global cooling. Generally, about maybe 0.8 of a degree Fahrenheit for up to about 3 years. But these are small volcanoes compared to those immediately after the flood. We have evidence that some were so huge they block out most of the sunlight for a month or two. And these stratovolcanoes that went off at the end of the flood, and mainly early post-flood, were huge. Look at the size of these cones. These represent tremendous volcanism and sending up huge layers of ash and aerosols in the stratosphere. And these are just in the Cascades here, maybe a dozen of them, is just a few of the hundreds across the Earth that were going off early in the Ice Age to replenish that ash and aerosol layer left over from the flood. And all this post-flood volcanism reinforces the ash and aerosols in the stratosphere to continue the cooling for hundreds of years. The second mechanism for an ice age is abundant moisture. Where does that come from? Well, At the end of the flood, the oceans were very warm. Why? Because the Genesis flood was a tectonic volcanic event, and a lot of probably groundwater was added to the pre-flood ocean, so you'd end up with a warm ocean from top to bottom and from pole to pole with no sea ice. Well, the significance of this is that with a warmer ocean, you get much more evaporation into the air. For instance, at an ocean temperature of 86 degrees Fahrenheit, you get 7 times the evaporation as you do at water that's 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So with warm oceans at mid and high latitudes, you get tremendous evaporation, and this moisture would get caught up into storms, and the storms would have so much more snowfall that would turn to ice for a rapid ice age. Dr. Larry Vardaman has modeled the effects of a warm ocean. In various storm patterns in the eastern Pacific, he's warmed up the temperatures, and he's shown how much precipitation you get in the Sierra Nevadas as well as Yellowstone National Park. And what he discovered is you get something like 4 to 8 to 4 to 10 times as much precipitation with a warm ocean off the coast for the Sierras, which had an ice cap, and also for Yellowstone Park that had an ice cap 3,000 feet deep. Another effect of the warm oceans, besides heavier precipitation, is that they would cause milder winters in the northern hemisphere as well as the southern hemisphere. The way that this works is the warm oceans heat up the air that spread inland, especially in wintertime in storms, and with the Arctic sea ice gone, it all adds up to much warmer winters. They would be below freezing in many areas, but they would be warmer than today. When the evaporation that comes from the ocean condenses, you add all that what's called latent heat to the atmosphere, which also heats up the atmosphere. So the climate in the early ice age, right after the flood, is one of cool summers and mild winters. So you had very little seasonal contrast at the start of the ice age. Another effect of the warm ocean is that it would keep some areas that were glaciated unglaciated until the middle or the end of the ice age. For instance, where you had onshore flow of warm air warmed by the ocean water, the glaciation would delay for a number of years. For instance, along the west coast of the United States, like the Puget Sound area, probably didn't glaciate until midway during the ice age. Same thing in the British Isles, which probably didn't glaciate till midway in the ice age. Also, this onshore flow of warm, moist air would affect the Arctic region, because with no Arctic sea ice and the Arctic Ocean probably starting at a temperature about 86 degrees Fahrenheit, you could probably swim in the Arctic Ocean for a while after the flood. This warm water would warm the air and add moisture and cause the lowlands of Siberia, Alaska, and the Yukon to be unglaciated. Not glaciated, it was only the mountains of Alaska, Siberia, and the Yukon Territory that were glaciated, which is a major mystery of Earth science. When they run their computer models of glaciation, often some of the first places to glaciate are the lowlands as well as the highlands of Siberia, Alaska, and the Yukon Territory. So they're perplexed on why these areas were not glaciated, but yet we can explain it with the post-flood ice age model by warm onshore flow of moist air in the Arctic. This also would cause heavy precipitation. So I would predict that early in the ice age, they probably were forests that grew clear to the Arctic Ocean. And then as it dried off towards the middle ice age period, these forests mostly died off. The third ingredient for an ice age, it has to persist year after year. And indeed, these mechanisms would persist year after year with the replenishment of the volcanic ash and aerosols from post-flood volcanism to evaporation of the oceans. This would continue for quite a while, but as the oceans cooled, your evaporation would become less and less, and so with time, you would get less moisture, and therefore there'd come a time the ice would build up to a maximum. I estimated that the oceans would probably be about 86 degrees Fahrenheit on the average after the flood. There'd be cool spots and there'd be warm spots, of course, but an average of 86 degrees Fahrenheit. The average temperature of the ocean right now is 4 degrees centigrade or 38 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a considerable cooling. But because of that cooling, you can time how long the ice age lasted by estimating the cooling of the ocean and the warming factors and adding them up, and you get a change in temperature, change in time. And if the temperature changed from about 86 degrees Fahrenheit and the ice age reached a maximum about, say, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a cooling of 36 degrees Fahrenheit, then I just solved for time, and that's where I got an approximate time of 500 years. It's a rough estimate, and I used maximum and minimum variables for all the heating and cooling factors for the ocean, and I bracketed the time between about 1,700 years and about 200 years. And the best estimate was about 500 years to reach glacial maximum. So it persists with time, but the ice age is rapid and it starts to end after about 500 years of buildup. Then it has to melt. First of all, you have to figure out how much ice and snow build up in that 500 years. And to do that, I had to figure where the moisture sources were. The main moisture source is the evaporation of the warm ocean, plus movement of warmer air and water vapor in that air from lower latitudes to higher latitudes. You got to figure out how much fell in the ocean versus the land. So I roughly estimated the average depth of the ice in the northern hemisphere is about 2,100 feet. In the southern hemisphere, which is mainly Antarctica, was about 4,000 feet. And then you got to figure out how long would it take to melt this. So I used the equation for the energy balance over a snow and ice cover. It's the same thing. You add up the heating factors for the ice and the cooling factors, and you add them all up and you get a change in temperature, change in time. But in this case, the temperature doesn't change. It stays at 32 degrees. So you can convert that into a melting factor. And it melts about 10 meters a year or 33 feet a year. And at that rate, the edge of the ice would melt in 70 years, and the interior of Canada, being cooler and with less solar radiation, would take more time, but that would cool in about 200 years. So the total time for the ice age was approximately 700 years based on the climatic aftermath of the Genesis flood. Well, here we are at Red Lodge, Montana, in south central Montana, at the entrance to Rock Creek Valley. I've calculated in the post-flood rapid ice age that the melting of these ice sheets would be complete in about 70 to 100 years along the edge of the ice sheet and in the mountainous areas. So that represents catastrophic melting. And when you have catastrophic melting, you have a huge amount of water coming down. And we are standing on a glacial outwash terrace from the ice cap that melted over the Beartooth Mountains. When it melted, it sent all this gravel through this area, and you can just barely see the edge of it along that pediment above the city of Red Lodge. You can see the lower part of the terrace over against the mountains there. I should say that's the top of the outwash terrace. As it comes along here at the base of the pediment, here it goes a couple miles. We're about a good 150 feet above the city here. Later on, it eroded part of it, and that is where the city of Red Lodge was built. There was no lakes ponded that I know of behind moraines that burst. It was just all catastrophic glacial melting, probably rivers half a mile wide, and they'd snake around and they'd deposit this gravel in a big, huge gravel bar that was left flat, and then it eroded after it was over with to form these terraces, and in the valleys where the city of Red Lodge was built. Here we are in the Madison Valley of southwest Montana. This valley is a long north-south valley, similar to a lot of other valleys in southwest Montana, that's composed of mountain ranges, generally flat-bottom valleys and other mountain ranges. But this valley is different than practically any valley in southwest Montana in that These flat surfaces you see here, which look like pediments, are not. They're glacial outwash material from when the ice sheet in Yellowstone melted. Now, the ice in Yellowstone was up to 3,000 feet deep during the Ice Age. And when it came time to melting, it melted rapidly and was catastrophic. This Madison Valley has the Madison River, and the terminal moraine upstream at West Yellowstone is about 50 miles away. And so when the ice melted, it probably melted and sent huge amounts of water and gravel that carpeted this whole valley from south to north, forming these terraces all across the valley. Then at other times, the current was too fast and it eroded part of it out, forming the terraces. And then it did it again, and probably again. That's why you have multiple terraces of gravel piled up in this monstrous outwash fan. Another huge outwash fan is in Jackson Hole, north of Jackson, Wyoming, where you see similar gravel terraces. And a few other drainages from the Yellowstone Park area, you see terraces, but they're a lot smaller than the Madison Valley and Jackson Hole, where the Snake River comes through. Now, there's probably about 200 feet of gravel, cobbles, and big boulders that came down when it melted. Now, the big boulders probably came down in icebergs with ice floating in the water because a lot of them are angular, so they didn't roll around. Some are sub-rounded. Well, here we are in Cody, Wyoming, in front of the Shoshone Water Gap, and we're standing on glacial outwash terraces from the Yellowstone ice cap that was about 3,000 feet deep, that melted rapidly late in the Ice Age. It was so catastrophic, it sent huge amounts of water with boulders coming down through Cody, Wyoming, and it formed a series of terraces, approximately 3 terraces up to maybe 150 feet above the river. And we're standing on probably the lowest terrace, but out in the background you can see several other terraces. Here we are at Lake Roosevelt, which is dammed by Grand Coulee Dam in north central Washington. This was the site of Glacial Lake Columbia during the Ice Age. It's about at least 1,000 feet higher than Lake Roosevelt. And it was dammed by a lobe of the Cordilleran Ice Sheet. It's called the Okanagan lobe. Came down the Okanagan Valley over there and blocked the Columbia River, creating a huge lake in here that backed up clear east past Spokane. Now, the Okanagan lobe is part of the Cordilleran Ice Sheet that covered much of British Columbia. This lobe probably started in the mountains, probably because of the warm onshore flow of moist air, probably kept the lowlands unglaciated for a while. But as time went on and the oceans cooled, it went from the mountains to the lowlands and filled up practically all of British Columbia. And then east of the Rocky Mountains, we had a second major ice sheet called the Laurentide Ice Sheet, and it covered central and eastern Canada and the northern United States. And they believe there might have been another lobe in northeast Canada. Now, other locations like in Europe and Asia, there was an ice sheet in northwest Europe and northwest Asia, including northwest Siberia. This one probably started in the mountains of Scandinavia and other mountains because we still had a lot of warm onshore flow because of that warm ocean. Then it worked its way low down and then probably worked its way south. And also over mountainous areas in the world, we had ice cap. So other mountains in the Rocky Mountains were glaciated. Even into northern Arizona, the San Francisco peaks were glaciated. In the southern hemisphere, Antarctica was glaciated. Probably glaciated starting in the mountains there and just filled in the lowlands and moved to the ocean in Antarctica. Same thing in Greenland. And in the tropical areas, all the main mountains that are pretty high had glaciers on them. Some have glaciers today. And we know that the glaciers were 3,000 feet lower in the tropical areas. So it was a worldwide glaciation. 30% of the land was glaciated compared to 10% today. Ever since the Great Ice Age, we've had just little tiny oscillations in climate. We had what's called the medieval warm period from about 800 AD to 1200 AD, where the Vikings settled southwest Greenland and farmed, and where they grew grapes in England and other plants grew in England that don't grow today. And then from about 1200 to 1400, we had the start of what's called the Little Ice Age. And this was a dip in the temperatures, of which practically all the glaciers in the world advanced. Some of them covering up towns or parts of towns in Switzerland, for instance. And then the Little Ice Age lasted to about 1880. And then since then, glaciers have been receding steadily on the average to this present day. Now, the cause of the Little Ice Age is very likely long-term oscillations on the sun that we can correlate with long-term sunspot cycles. For instance, at the peak of the Little Ice Age, it was during what's called the Maunder Minimum, which was about an 80-year period of around 1700 where there were hardly any sunspots. And the way it works is the fewer the sunspots, the cooler the climate. There's a strong correlation. So, and we've been observing sunspots since 1610. So we had this Maunder Minimum where we had maybe 40 sunspots in an 80-year period when we should have had 40,000. Why? Not sure. There's forces on the sun. And this was the worst time of the Little Ice Age, was during this. Superimposed on these long-term fluctuations due to the sun, we also had a lot of volcanism, and the volcanism would cause short period coolings that would cause the glaciers to advance even faster. Then when there's little volcanism, we'd have a warm period. So the Little Ice Age is strong correlation with long-term changes on the sun. Same with the medieval warm period, is probably a period of a lot of sunspots. Since the late 1800, we've had a lot of sunspots, and we've generally been in the warmer cycle of the sunspot cycle. A question always comes up of how many ice ages were there? They used to say there were 4 ice ages, and this is based on an analysis of the glacial debris in the central United States, central and northern Midwest. And then when they thought there were only 4, they saw 4 everywhere, or 3 or 5, or something like 4. If there's only 3, it got missed one time, they would say. It was kind of like a circular reasoning where they saw it everywhere. And in fact, even though the concept's been dead over 30 years, it still is in some museums. Now, they realize that when a glacier forms and moves, it tears up the previous ice ages, and so you can't really tell. So now they say we got to go to the ocean bottom to determine the number of ice ages. So they take these deep sea cores and they core the bottom of the ocean. They bring it up and they analyze a number of variables in it. The percentage of carbonates, also the percentage of a certain isotope of oxygen. They do this ratio of oxygen 16 to oxygen 18, and they analyze this down the core. And it wiggles like this, it's high and then it goes low, high, low. And down the core, they get multiple oscillations. In fact, up to 50 now, and they claim that the cause of those oxygen oscillations is due to the interglacial cycles on land. And so they claim now there's 50 ice ages in regular succession in the last 2.5 million years of uniformitarian Earth history. The last 800,000, they were separated by 100,000 years. Before that, they were separated by 40,000 years. You might wonder, why is that? Well over 60 theories, they decided they're going to believe in the astronomical theory due to the orbital changes in the geometry of the Earth going around the sun, slight changes in the orbit, it'll be a little flatter, the tilt of the Earth changes a little bit, and the precession of the equinox They call it, it just changes the geometry of the Earth-Sun relationship so that you get a little different sunlight in different areas. Because of these changes in the geometry of the Earth, the amount of sunlight varies seasonally and latitudinally, and when you get low solar radiation in high northern latitudes, that's supposed to be correlated with ice ages. And when you get more sunlight, it's correlated with interglacials. So this is how they do it. And they make these cycles up, and they fit everything into these cycles because they believe in the astronomical theory of the ice ages. And it's these deep sea cores that they claim is evidence. But there's a lot of variables associated with these interpretations. This is interpretation of data. You do have the wiggles. There's lots of other variables involved. I don't believe they have anything to do with the ice age. How do we tell how many ice ages there were? Well, you go on land and you take a look. Usually in most areas you see evidence of only one glaciation in areas glaciated. In fact, the secular scientists are starting to realize this. I just pulled up an article from the technical journal. It's called The Developments in Quaternary Science, volume 17, page 575 to 589. And this is talking about glaciation in Alberta. And this reinforces other papers in the past. This is by Lionel Jackson and two others. They conclude that in the Rocky Mountain foothills of Alberta, there was only one ice age. And also in other areas of Alberta, the evidence is that there was only one ice age. And in other areas where there's stacked till sheets, which are separated by, we'll say, sand or other debris, they can be explained by one ice age. That's where they got the multiple ice ages at the boundary because of the complications of the ice lobes shifting and backing up, retreating and advancing, surging. So they're coming to the conclusion that there was only one ice age. But there is other evidence there was only one. South of the ice sheet, you had a lot of wind-blown silt called loess, especially in North America and Northwest Europe. This loess, when they analyze it, it comes from mainly, or almost totally from what they believe was the last ice age. Where is all the wind-blown silt from all the previous ice ages? Well, they don't know, and they don't know where it went if it disappeared. So to me, this is pretty strong evidence there was only one ice age. But here's another piece of evidence. When you go beyond the edge of the ice sheet, maybe 100 miles north of the boundary, you find a few areas that were not glaciated. They were missed. They're called driftless areas. One famous area is southwest Wisconsin. Another area is in northeast Montana and adjacent Saskatchewan that were missed. Well, why would they be missed? They were not glaciated at all. If you had multiple glaciations, a couple glaciations, 4 like they used to believe, or 50 now that they believe, how could those places be missed all this time? But in one ice age, of which the ice sheet was a lot thinner than they believe, which there is evidence for that, you can miss a few areas by chance. So it can be accounted for by one ice age in which the ice sheet was fairly thin. One more piece of evidence that there's only one ice age, there's maybe a half dozen, is that a lot of animals lived during the ice age. Woolly mammoths, a lot of them are extinct now. At the end of their last ice age, in their scheme, we had huge extinction, a major mystery of science. We didn't have any extinctions after any of the other ice ages, or except maybe isolated 1 or 2. But we had huge, massive extinction of large animals at the end of their last one. Why not at the end of their 50 have all these extinctions? To me, it's because they never existed, but only one, and it was after the end of the post-flood ice age. Here we are at the northern end of Banks Lake in northern Upper Grand Coulee. At this spot, we were on the edge of the Okanagan lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet. This brings up the question, how does the ice age, which was caused by the Genesis flood, account for all the secondary mysteries? I believe it's because it was a unique ice age, much different than the uniformitarian ice age, which was bitterly cold. And in fact, I don't think that there can be a uniformitarian ice age because you have to cool off summer temperatures at least 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the northern United States by present processes of climate change. How can you do that? And if you do get a cooling, where do you get the moisture? Because the cooler the air, the less moisture it holds. If you do find something that'll cool the temperature off, you cause a drying too. And that's not conducive to forming ice sheets. So that's why there's 60 theories or more about the origin of the ice sheet. They all have severe problems, even the astronomical theory of the ice age. Well, the uniformitarians can't find present processes that will persist year after year for the ice age. So they not only can't explain the ice age, they can't explain the subsidiary or secondary mysteries associated with the ice age. But here's how the post-flood ice age can explain all these mysteries. First of all, the post-flood ice age did not have cold winters at the beginning. In fact, they were mild winters with cool summers. You need the summer cooling for the ice sheets, but where the ice occurred in most areas, it's cold enough in winter. In fact, you'd be better if it was warmer because you get more precipitation, because the warmer the air, the more moisture it holds. So with mild winters and cool summers, you can explain these. First of all, how do you get mild winters during the ice age? Well, because you had that warm ocean. It's warm from top to bottom and pole to pole. Probably in the 80s at mid and high latitudes, early in the ice age. And the significance of this is much more evaporation with warmer ocean temperatures than with cooler ocean temperatures, adding just a huge abundance of moisture. And when you add this moisture, you also add heat, because you heat up the air from the warm ocean, and the water evaporated in the atmosphere, when it condenses, adds what's called latent heat, which is a huge heat source. So these two heat sources would end up causing mild winters, because storms would circulate all this air throughout the mid and high latitudes, evening it out, causing mild winters. In fact, Siberia and Alaska would be very mild winters, because with a warm Arctic Ocean, warm onshore flow, the temperatures are probably something like 50 degrees warmer in winter than they are today. And how do we get the cool summers? Well, we get the cool summers because of all the volcanic ash and aerosols in the stratosphere that reflect sunlight back to space, caused by the volcanism during the flood and for copious post-flood volcanism during the ice age. And the effect is mainly in the big continental masses, the mid and high latitudes. And so that's where you'll be your major cooling. So essentially you don't have much of a seasonal contrast at the beginning of the ice age. And therefore, we can answer the first question of why it wasn't glaciated in the lowlands of Siberia, Alaska, and the northwest Yukon Territory of Canada. It's because you had a warm Arctic Ocean, warm Pacific Ocean, lots of onshore flow, lots of precip because it was moist. And so it'd be too warm early and mid-ice age. By the end of the ice age, things were drying out to the point where you weren't going to get any ice sheets in the lowlands. Secondly, this answers the questions of why we had animals that loved the warmth associated with animals that loved the cold during the ice age. This is exactly what causes it, is the mild temperatures in winter and the cool temperatures in summer. This is fairly well known. And so the warmth of winter will cause a lot of warm climate animals to be a lot further north. This explains disharmonious associations. Not only did Siberia have lots of woolly mammoths, it was just as rich as a Serengeti in Africa, it is said by Dale Guthrie at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. We had a lot of animals, many of which could not live that far north. Then the other example that can be explained is the hippos in northwest Europe. How do you get the hippos up there after the flood? Because they all spread out from the mountains of Ararat. Well, here's how I believe that can occur. When you had warm oceans, the west coasts of continents get warm onshore flow, because you generally have a flow from west to east. And so the warm onshore flow would keep northwest Europe warm in the winter and moist, and probably 4 times the precipitation as today. So it would be a great environment for hippos to spread up there. early in the Ice Age. But as time went on, the winters become cooler and cooler, and the hippos get trapped up there. They don't know that they need to go south. Eventually the woolly mammoths and cold taller animals of the Ice Age move in there because the ice starts growing on England and Northern Europe. And it probably starts in the mountains, maybe midway in the Ice Age because of the onshore flow, and descends to the lowlands. The woolly mammoths spread into these areas of northwest Europe, and they all die together, mainly late in the Ice Age because of the cold winters and the warmer summers that occurred late in the Ice Age. They died together in Ice Age sediments. The post-flood Ice Age model accounts for disharmonious associations. Another effect of the warm oceans is to cause much heavier precipitation in currently dry areas of the Earth. And this is a major mystery of Earth science. At 30 degrees north and south latitude, we have sinking air that causes generally a dry belt across the Earth today. And this is where major deserts are located on the Earth today. But during the Ice Age, we have evidence that they were once much wetter. For instance, in the southwest United States, we have evidence of dozens of lakes that existed during the Ice Age in what are now dry areas. For instance, Great Salt Lake, which is an average of 12 feet deep, there was a lake in that area that was 800 feet deep called Lake Bonneville, and it was 10 times the area. And other lakes were in Death Valley and other areas in Nevada and also southeast Oregon. And we see their shorelines on these lakes today still, which indicates that these lakes exist in the post-flood period. I believe that these lakes first filled up or partially filled up at the end of the flood because they're in basins, enclosed basins. And as the continents come up out of the floodwaters, they would have water trapped in them. But these lakes continued and built up during the Ice Age. We know this because Lake Bonneville raised and overflowed into southeast Idaho, causing the Bonneville flood during the Ice Age. So we know that these lakes increased in altitude because of the heavier precipitation. Other areas around the Earth, we know that there are lakes in currently dry areas of Australia. The Dead Sea area had a deeper lake in that area. The Sahara Desert had rivers and lakes. And some of the fossils we find there are of amphibious animals like hippopotamuses, there's giraffes and other large animals in the Sahara. And man has left artwork showing some of the animals as well by the tens of thousands in the Sahara Desert. Same with Saudi Arabia. So these areas were wet during the Ice Age, but this is a major mystery of secular Earth science because they can't account for why these areas would be wet. And this idea that they use is called uniformitarianism. This is the idea that uniform or gradual processes that we see going on today account for all the past, including the rocks and the fossils, and also past climates, like the climates of the Ice Age. That's what the secular scientists assume, uniformitarianism, which developed in the 1700s and became formalized in the early 1800s as a dogma or assumption of earth science and geology and glaciology. This principle they have to use, and so that's why they have so many mysteries, because they look at the present climate and they see how can we explain that past climate by present climate change, which are very slight changes. But the Ice Age climate was a huge climate change. So this is why they run into so many mysteries, of which one of them is the problem of wet deserts in the recent past during the Ice Age. Well, the post-flood rapid Ice Age, with its mild winters and cool summers, can also explain the spread out of the animals and man across the globe. For instance, with the lowlands of Siberia and Alaska not glaciated, but mild during the winter, maybe probably up to 50 degrees warmer, A lot of animals that can't tolerate much cold could easily spread up into northeast Siberia, and they can cross into Alaska, because between Alaska and Siberia there was a shallow strait, the Bering Strait, and that was either exposed early in the Ice Age because of tectonics, but we know at least it was exposed later in the Ice Age as sea level dropped because of ice piling up on land. In fact, the whole Bering Shelf and the Arctic Ocean were exposed for hundreds of miles. We find fossils on the shelves, and even on some islands hundreds of miles off the coast. So we know the sea level drop exposed the shelves. But these animals can spread from Siberia to Alaska. And then how would they get down to the United States, Central America, and South America? Well, because during the Ice Age we had another phenomenon occur, especially early in the Ice Age when we had mild winters. Along the east slopes of the Rockies we have the Chinook Effect, which is a downslope foehn wind that warms and dries. So you'd have a dry belt, and probably one that didn't form an ice sheet, along the east slopes of the Rockies from the Yukon down through Alberta, Montana. In that area it's called the ice-free corridor because of the Chinook Effect. So animals can spread from lowlands of Alaska through the Northwest Territory and down that ice-free corridor into the United States and South America and Central America. And we had huge amounts of animals during the Ice Age living in these areas. And this is how they would spread. And man would also spread through this corridor early in the Ice Age. But late in the Ice Age, as the ice sheets got thicker and the oceans cooled off, it would fill in. Because we know it filled in because we have Ice Age debris in Alberta in those areas. We also have a lot of fossils underneath the Ice Age debris of some of those animals like mastodons and mammoths. These are some of those that passed through the corridor that lived there for a while and got trapped during the Ice Age and are under the Ice Age debris. You had a similar situation for animals spreading to Australia. In Southeast Asia, it'd be warm even during the Ice Age. So as sea level drops, there's a huge shallow areas, and so they can make it pretty close to Australia. There'd be a few deep areas, and some can swim, or maybe man took some to Australia, but this is how I believe they can spread to Australia, which is kind of a mystery of why you get all these marsupials there. Either man brought them or they quickly spread after the flood over shallow areas of Southeast Asia. Well, the post-flood rapid ice age can also explain the extinctions at the end of the ice age. But first we must talk about their multiplication early in the ice age, right after the flood. The environment with cool summers and mild winters and heavy precipitation would be ideal for large mammals to just really thrive and spread out all over the world. These animals were not used to cold, and they weren't used to drought. They were used to a different environment than what the uniformitarian ice ages indicate, which are cold and generally dry, especially towards the end of their ice ages. So they would thrive. They'd spread all over Siberia, down into the United States, Central America and South America. It was a dynamic ice sheet. It wasn't steady state for very long. These mild winters and cool summers were changing as time went on. As the oceans were cooling, you were getting less precipitation towards a late ice age. You're getting colder temperatures in wintertime, but summers were warming up and the ice was starting to melt because of the warmer summers. So you melt the ice by the warmer summers, and if the winters are cold enough, you don't get that much precipitation, so you don't add much during the winter, so you just have a net melting. And the animals weren't used to colder winters, so they were stressed. So the uniformitarian ideas fall far, far short. One of the most significant mysteries is the extinction of the woolly mammoths in Siberia, Alaska, and the Northwest Yukon Territory. First of all, how many were there? If it was just a few, that wouldn't be any big deal, but according to the experts that study the mammals of the Ice Age in that region, there are millions of them still buried in the permafrost. The bones and tusks of the woolly mammoth are so well preserved, you can use the ivory of the tusks still today. Why are they well preserved? If they sat around in the elements, within a matter of 24 years they would have disintegrated. So why are they so well preserved? And again, why are they in the permafrost? Permafrost is rock hard. How would you get them down in the permafrost? How can us creationists explain these woolly mammoths? Obviously they lived after the flood because they're in the permafrost. They're associated with the Ice Age because you find their bones on top of glacial debris in northwest Siberia. So they actually lived during and at the very end of the Ice Age, and we're following generally the Ice Age as ice sheets were melting in northwest Siberia northward. They were kind of following up on them, and then a lot of them died right on top of the glacial debris. So they're from the post-flood Ice Age period. So how does the Ice Age account for them? Well, here's how I think it happened in the unique post-flood Ice Age. The climate of the post-flood Ice Age had mild winters and cool summers at the beginning. And because the Arctic Ocean was warm, you probably could take a swim in the Arctic Ocean right after the flood. And because of all this warm ocean and warm onshore flow and evaporation, Siberia and Alaska would have mild winters with heavy precipitation, and so it was probably forested early in the Ice Age. But as the Ice Age grew and the Arctic Ocean surface cooled off more and more, it would cool off and it become drier. In the early part of the Ice Age and in the middle part of the Ice Age, it became a grassland. It'd be an ideal environment for woolly mammoths and many other animals that just slowly move up there by the millions and live there. Because it wasn't so cold in the winter, it wouldn't challenge them because of the coldness. And there was no permafrost, so there weren't any summer bogs. Because at the end of the flood, it was newly laid sediments and they would have been from warm water, so there wasn't any permafrost practically by definition right after the flood. And it would hold off for quite a while. Permafrost is caused by freezing temperatures from the air and they cool the ground from the surface down. Permanently frozen soil. It doesn't thaw out except for the top in the summer. There's a lot of evidence that there was no permafrost in those regions. One of the animals that lived in Siberia as well as northern Alaska and the northern Yukon Territory was a saga antelope. And the saga antelope has real small hooves and they can't negotiate permafrost. They like wide open spaces of solid ground, which indicates that there's no permafrost. Other indications of no permafrost is that you had a lot of burrowing mammals. How can an animal burrow in permafrost? Two burrowing animals was the badger and the ferret. You also had beavers there, which I'm sure it'd be very hard to live in an area like that with permafrost. So there is plenty of evidence there's no permafrost, which is totally against the uniformitarian idea where they believe permafrost has been there for millions of years. The post-flood rapid ice age provides an ideal environment for why they would be up in Siberia. Also, there's plenty to eat because it was a grassland. In fact, it's been determined in areas non-glaciated in the mid-latitudes and the high latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere is one huge grassland all around the Northern Hemisphere. And it's been called by Dale Guthrie of the University of Alaska in Fairbanks the Mammoth Steppe, S-T-E-P-P-E. That's a term for a grassland essentially, like the high plains of today, that has a wet spring and a dry summer and late fall. So you get a lot of grass that grows and dries out. And that's kind of the environment they think of up in Siberia, which is totally different than that area now. The Ice Age was dynamic. It was always changing. Talk about your climate change. You had climate changes on fast. In the late Ice Age, the oceans were cooling off. And then you were having less evaporation and more sea ice was developing and the glaciers were starting to melt and spreading fresh water over the salt water, causing sea ice to form a lot faster. And once you get sea ice, you cap the oceans from evaporating, so you cause more drying. And with the cold ice sheets in place still, even though they're melting, and the low latitudes warming, you have strong north-south temperature differences. And that's what drives the winds aloft. So you'd have a lot stronger winds than you do today and a lot drier conditions. So The climate at the end of the Ice Age would be characterized by dry, strong storms. And these storms would whip up a lot of dust, of which we find lots of evidence of this all over the world in the form of a windblown silt called lust. It's just south of the ice sheet in the United States and in Europe, and lots of it over Siberia and Alaska. These strong winds could explain this windblown dust. It's this combination that caused the animals at the end of the Ice Age to go extinct, as well as the woolly mammoth and the Columbian mammoths at the end of the Ice Age. To specifically find out how they died, I went to the experts who've been studying them and found out what sediments that they're buried in. And the experts say that they're mostly buried in this windblown silt. So this brings up a lot of options to explain the other mysteries associated with the woolly mammoth. For instance, the windblown silt during these dry, strong, windy storms could cover up a dead animal pretty fast and preserve it. That's why they're well preserved, because they were buried pretty fast in windblown silt. But then what about the other mysteries, like the standing position in some of the carcasses and skeletons, and the suffocation, the broken bones? Well, the dust can explain that. Also, they can explain how they got in the permafrost. Okay, here's how this can work. As the windblown silt covers them up, the permafrost is forming, especially late in the Ice Age, and it's forming and getting deeper and deeper in the ground. The dust that forms on these animals, the permafrost comes up from the ground, and also the cooling comes down from the top, so the windblown silt freezes pretty fast to help preserve them to this day. The standing position, the suffocation, the broken bones can be caused by huge dust storms. You'd expect monstrous dust storms once in a while. And to understand this, I went to information on the Dust Bowl era in the 1930s in the Midwest, where you had huge dust storms. Some of these dust storms in the Midwest covered up fences, machinery, and sometimes covered up barns or houses clear to the roof. This is how I believe you can explain the condition of some of the carcasses. They were out eating what they could, and suddenly the wind picked up. They turned their back to the wind. Then a strong, dry cold front comes through, and the wind whips up, and the visibility goes to zero, and the silt starts packing up around them. They act like a snow fence in a blizzard, and dust will pack like snow hard, and once you get stuck in it, you can hardly move. And so as it piles up around them, he breathes this dust, and they suffocate, and they end up not being able to move or fall down, and they end up in a general standing position. And trying to extricate himself out of the dust that's packing around them, they can easily twist their leg bones and break them by shearing or torsion force. Now, we have evidence that this could easily happen, because at Hot Springs, South Dakota, we have an ancient sinkhole, or an Ice Age sinkhole, where we have about 100 mammoths, some of them woolly mammoths, most of them Columbian mammoths. And the sinkhole filled up with windblown silt and is now a kind of a mound. Some of those mammoths have broken limb bones, and Larry Eggenbrod, the chief United States expert on woolly mammoths, says that about the only way that can happen is by twisting, trying to extricate themselves out of mud. Well, the same thing would happen with woolly mammoths trying to get out of solid, packed, windblown silt all around it. So you can explain the broken limb bones that way. But what about the broken pelvis and ribs? Here's how I believe this happens. Once the woolly mammoth was totally interred within the windblown silt, covered up, and the permafrost has come up to meet the woolly mammoth and frozen from the top, he ends up in the permafrost. But permafrost is known to fault and shift. It can shift up to 50 feet sometimes. And this is how they can break the ribs and bones. After they're already in there, the permafrost can shift and break the pelvis and rib bones while they're in the permafrost. So the late post-flood rapid ice age can explain the mysteries of the woolly mammoths. But there's still one that needs to be explained, and that is the state of the decay of the vegetation in their stomach. How do we explain that? Do we need a quick freeze? Well, I don't think so, because you find preserved vegetation, half-preserved vegetation in mastodons that died in peat bogs in the northeast United States. And no one suggests a quick freeze for mastodons in the northeast United States. So there's something else going on to cause that state of preservation. I looked at elephant digestion, and elephants have a peculiar digestion, just like horses. They don't digest their food in their stomach. It's a holding space for the vegetation. It's acidic, so it half decays by the acid. But the main digestion is after the stomach, in the intestines. You don't need a quick freeze, you need a moderate freeze, which you can have with a cold, dry cold front that passes by, and the temperatures maybe fall to 50 below pretty quick. And so they're frozen at a moderate rate, and that's how you explain the decay of the half-decayed vegetation, as well as the preservation of some of the soft tissues. They were fairly quickly frozen, but not a quick freeze down to 150 degrees Fahrenheit below zero, which I believe is impossible. Well, some may ask, in the post-flood rapid ice age, can we account for millions of woolly mammoths in Siberia, Alaska, and the Yukon Territory during the short ice age of 700 years? Can we account for 50 million mammoths in a short ice age? Actually, we can. Even though mammoths reproduce very slowly, it about takes them till age 10 to reproduce, and they have one or two babies, mostly one, every couple years. But once they get going, due to geometric progression, the population can mushroom because very few animals can take down a woolly mammoth. To estimate this, I used as examples the doubling of elephants in African preserves. Now, they're not ideal environments because you have poaching going on. But in one preserve in Africa, they doubled every 10 years. So if you start with 2 woolly mammoths, or you could start with 2 elephant kinds coming off the ark, of which the genes of mammoths soon segregated, and you double them every 10 years. Well, within about 300 years, you have billions by that calculation. So it's pretty easy to get millions of mammoths, 50 million or so mammoths in a 700-year ice age. Another more minor mystery associated with the woolly mammoths is that you find their bones and tusks, tremendous amounts of them on the New Siberian islands, which are in the Arctic Ocean. And people wondered, how come there's so many there? Well, I believe this can be explained in the post-flood rapid ice age, because when sea level was lower, the long continental shelf of the Arctic Ocean, which is about 300 some odd miles long, was mostly exposed by the end of the ice age. So the woolly mammoths would be out there on the continental shelves, of which we have lots of evidence because they find their bones in the sediments of the current continental shelves. But as sea level rose, when the ice was melting, sometimes it would rise fast due to catastrophic melting or the release of water from large trapped lakes like Glacial Lake Missoula, raising sea levels suddenly. So sea levels coming up fast, and the woolly mammoths and other animals on the continental shelf see the water coming towards them, and so where do they head? Well, they head for a bunch of hills out on the continental shelf, which at that time would be called the New Siberian Hills. And they would congregate there from the rising water. But as the water's rising, it comes around and cuts them off from the mainland. And there they become trapped by the tens of thousands, maybe the hundreds of thousands on those islands, which are pretty hilly. And there they die fairly quickly because there's not enough to eat. And that's why you find their bones on the surface in the permafrost, a considerable amount on the New Siberian Islands. The Ice Age is a great mystery of Earth science. but yet it can be explained by the flood. The flood was a great volcanic event and tectonic event, and at the end there'd be all this volcanic ash and aerosols in the stratosphere reflecting sunlight back to space, cooling the land surfaces mainly in summer. Also, the warm ocean caused by the flood from pole to pole and top to bottom would cause a lot more evaporation at mid and high latitudes to be picked up by storms and dumped very rapidly on the land for a rapid ice age. This ice age can be timed by the cooling of the ocean. Also, we can figure out its approximate depth. The ice sheets will come to a maximum, stop, and then melt as the oceans cool. And based on the cooling time of the ocean, by making some assumptions, the ice sheet would build up to a maximum in about 500 years. And then it would melt rapidly. The winters would be cooling off and becoming colder and drier, less moisture, so that summer melting is more efficient, so it would drop pretty fast. I calculate about 33 feet a year along the edge, so you'd have catastrophic melting. So the total time for an ice age is 700 years. This is an example of how we solve earth science challenges. The uniformitarian scientists are challenged with the ice age. They have over 60 theories and can't explain it so radical of a climate change. But we can explain it as the aftermath of the flood, which shows that the flood was a real event and also verifies what we read in the Bible. We can trust the Bible as God's word, and its history is true, and what we read about how we get to heaven, how we live our life on earth, the spiritual aspects are true also. We can trust them.